Arsenal have actually gone from having the second biggest to the fifth biggest in the league.
They will view it as an opportunity to grow their revenue even further.
It's almost a no-brainer. There's a lot to be said for the Premier League being strong enough to say we don't need to take the low-hanging fruit. An FA Cup final abroad or a Champions League final. It could work much easier than a run-of-the-mill Premier League game. And can they prove that City's breaches caused that loss? It's going to be a very, very complicated issue to deal with. I'd be very, very doubtful that it's only those four teams. I think there's a very good chance that the vote will be pulled.
The thing that struck me about United was that it felt like a big but still a family club, and there's a feeling that it's lost a lot of that. It's lost a lot of its soul.
Hello, this is How Football Works. I'm Olly Clink. With me today, Man City's former financial advisor, Stefan Borson, and sports journalist, Matt Hughes. Gentlemen, great to have you along. Let's start at the Emirates, because Arsenal are on the hunt for a new sporting director after the departure of Edu. Some reports suggest that they are looking at the current PSG sporting director, Luis Campos, as their number one target following Edu leaving the club. And crucially, the PSG man hasn't renewed his contract for next season either. Matt, I'll start with you on this. How likely do we think it is that Campos could end up at Arsenal?
I think it's very early days for Arsenal in this search. They were slightly taken aback by the timing of Edu leaving mid-season, and as a result, they're going to take their time to get a replacement in. They can't get anyone in time for the January transfer window because that's obviously 6 weeks away. As a result, there's no huge rush, so they'll be looking at candidates for next summer. I'm certain Luis Campos will be one of those. Fits the profile. He did an amazing job at Monaco, recruited Mbappe, Bernardo Silva, players of that calibre. One thing about him is he's 60 years old. He's actually he's a part-time advisor at PSG. Whether he would have the appetite to take on a big job like this at Arsenal, I'm not sure, but they're right to look at him.
Stefan, on that point that they won't be able to get someone in before that January transfer window, how detrimental could that be for Arsenal?
Yeah, I think probably limited impact for January itself. You would expect the plans to have already been laid quite early on, probably before Edu left. I think the bigger issue is perhaps actually the time that it's going to take to get somebody out of another club. So we know, for the same reason that Edu has gone from Arsenal, gardening leave now is a big thing for sporting directors and people in those roles because people want their knowledge to have faded by the time they move to the new club. So although they're not in a rush for January, given that people are often on 6-month notice periods and 6 months gardening leave for these sorts of roles, and we know, of course, from Newcastle and Dan Ashworth that it can be even more, I would think they'd actually want to get on with it because I think they are going to want somebody in place for the summer. But January, I think, in answer to your question directly, I think January is probably of less importance. If they are going to make signings or one big signing, I would think it's already well in play and therefore the impacts will be limited. But it's definitely, those long lead-in times now with sporting directors are something people have to look quite closely at.
Dan Ashworth must have the nicest garden in the whole country.
Preening it for almost a year, yeah.
Matt, just going back to Campos, because you mentioned there's some of the names that he has signed over the years, some fantastic players. But he's known for getting talent young and then maybe selling them for big fees. And we're even seeing that at PSG with the likes of Vitinha and Barcola. When you look at Arsenal's most recent business, with the exception of a few, of course, signings like Trossard and Zinchenko and Jesus and Raya, they seem to have gone for more experienced players with Premier League experience. So if someone like Campos was to come in, would that feel like a shift in the way that they're doing their business?
It depends on how he wants to operate. When you're working in France, with the exception of PSG, of course, you don't really have any other option other than to go young, bringing in players to the country. That's what he did with Monaco and Lille subsequently. If you're working for Arsenal, you're sort of shopping in a different supermarket, really, just because the budget is so much bigger. The best sporting directors can adapt to different circumstances. It would be fascinating to see, for example, how Hugo Viana translates from working at Sporting Lisbon to Manchester City. Completely different club in terms of size, scale and budget, but yet City think he's the man for the job. So you can adapt.
Now, another area that they may have been looking at is the expansion of the Emirates as well. It was once the biggest stadium in London, 60,000 capacity, before their neighbours Spurs overtook them by going up to 62,000. It's always those little wins, isn't it? But Matt, how serious could these plans be for Arsenal to expand their stadium as it currently is?
Well, they're definitely looking at it. There's been sort of murmurs for a while that they were looking at potential plans, and then there was a very well-sourced report on Bloomberg a couple of days ago saying they actually wanted to take the Emirates up to 80,000 capacity, which surprised me because having been there on match days for 15, 20 years now, it can be quite challenging getting in and out at 60. So never mind the stadium implications, they'd have to do a lot of work on the local infrastructure, roads, rail, tube, those tunnels that you have to be herded through to get to the ground. To get this going. So I imagine they'll be looking at a range of options, and that's the most ambitious and of course expensive. So we'll see where it goes. But it'll take a long time for these plans to come to fruition, I think.
Stefan, when we look at this a bit more broadly as well, it's not just Arsenal looking to expand their stadium. There's been conversations, we believe, at Newcastle. We've already seen some clubs do it, like Fulham and Liverpool as well. Arsenal have actually gone from having the second biggest to the fifth biggest in the league. Why are clubs looking at this? Is this to do with PSR calculations and trying to bring in as much revenue as possible?
Yeah, I mean, all of these clubs want to maximise match day, as it's classified within most of these accounts, increase that dramatically from where it's been. In particular, the London clubs are in a preferable position in terms of the amount of money they can get per seat, so per game, per seat. And that therefore means that when you do the calculations on the return on the investment, it can make a lot of sense. Now, that's particularly so where you're not having to rebuild the stadium, you're not having to close the stadium for a year, you're able to build upon the existing infrastructure. And so Arsenal are probably one of the few where if they can find a way to get in another 10, 20,000 seats, it's going to make a lot of financial sense. Now, it's not quite the same in situations where you need to effectively knock a stadium down, rebuild it, and potentially be out of that stadium for a year, so there's more challenges in some of the other clubs. But I think for Arsenal, it makes perfect sense. If they can get 80,000 in there, that incremental 20,000 seats per match day, and then on top of that, whatever else they're selling in terms of the stadium for concerts or other usage, is going to make a lot of sense. So if they can do it, and I think there are clearly planning issues in the local area. We know possibly not quite as bad as Kensington where Chelsea are, but Islington's going to be pretty difficult to get through on a planning perspective. But if they can, then it's going to make a lot of sense. As long as they're keeping the spending of the infrastructure to something reasonable. But you would think, as I say, because they're not building a completely new stadium, that the numbers are going to work.
I just want to ask you one thing, because we kind of potentially get into a grey area given some of the charges that were put towards Everton recently when they had some points deducted. When clubs are trying to update their stadiums, what does that do in terms of PSR calculations? Does it go towards it?
No, all stadium costs should be excluded from the PSR calculation. Of course, by the time Arsenal get around to building the stadium, we won't even have the existing PSR rules. There'll be a new set of rules in place. And we don't know precisely what they're going to look like, but of course we know they're going to be in the direction of the UEFA rules. But the fine detail is yet to come out. But you would expect all of the stadium infrastructure costs to be excluded, including the interest paid in respect of building that part of the stadium. So from a financial perspective, you can get this. This is why clubs can feel that they can build the infrastructure without worrying too much about the short-term impact on PSR and thinking very much about the long-term impact of having another 20,000 seats over the next 50 years. And that's the equation that they're running. and particularly with that exclusion around the sustainability rules. And that's likely to be the case, whatever form of sustainability rules come in. They are likely to exclude the building of stadia, which is seen as good spending by UEFA and also the Premier League.
Matt, they're looking potentially, if Arsenal can expand their stadium to 75,000, which is 15,000 more seats, they will pocket over 5 million more per game, which is a 23.5% increase on their current revenue. So you can see the benefits here. What do you think about the target that they could and should be setting if they do want to expand their stadium?
It depends on the cost and the time frame, I think, and that will be a balancing act between how quickly they can get it done and how much it will cost them. And until we've seen the plans, it's really hard to know where that balance will lie. One thing to say is Arsenal, they don't need to do this. If they're doing it, they're doing it from a position of strength because their matchday revenue is already pretty good, despite the fact that the stadium is now the 5th biggest, as you say, and that's because it's always sold out and they can charge high prices because they've got a very good team and they're in North London. I think Tottenham have gone past them in terms of Premier League's matchday revenue, but Arsenal are still close behind and they're streets ahead of the likes of Chelsea and even Man City, who have got a 60,000 pound stadium, but it's in Manchester, so they can't charge the same prices. Chelsea, as we know, are the club with the real problem because they've got 40,000 seats because it was redeveloped 20, 30 years ago now. The corporate offering is actually pretty small as a percentage of the stadium's capacity. And they've got those huge infrastructure problems with the railway and just lack of space, etc. And also the two owners aren't speaking to each other, which never helps get big building projects off the ground. So, compared to those clubs, Arsenal are actually already in a very good position. So the actual, while it might, it's bragging rights and ego, West Ham have got a bigger ground than you, that's not the only metric that matters, it's what they can charge for each seat.
Well, I was going to ask you about that. Is there an element here of them not wanting to be left behind because they've already slipped to 5th in that table? Is there any sense for you, when you say they don't need to do it, is it because they feel as if they've been overtaken and want to build themselves back up purely based on their stadium size? I
don't think that would be the primary reason. That they will view it as an opportunity to grow their revenue even further, and if they can get it done, it will do that, and then they will be probably the richest club by matchday revenue in the Premier League. Manchester United obviously have got grand plans to possibly knock down Old Trafford and build a 100,000 seat stadium, but Stefan's alluded to that's a much bigger, more expensive, problematic project because they're going to have to possibly have to find somewhere else to play in the interim, and already they were hoping to have a decision by Christmas. That's been put back another 6 months. So that just shows that these projects can take a long time to get going.
How many more Premier League clubs do you know are exploring this as an avenue to create more revenue for themselves?
Well, Newcastle have plans. Manchester United have plans. Chelsea's plans are on hold, but there's an issue to be addressed, and they're looking at it. They're talking about maybe trying to go back to Earl's Court, a site they've examined many times and never managed to purchase. Fulham, obviously, their new stand is nearly completed. I think most clubs are looking, and bigger picture, the reason is it's one of the few areas of potential growth because the domestic broadcast deal is basically flat. They've managed the one that starts next season with Sky Sports and TNT. They've managed to replicate the old number, but only by selling more games. So the per game value is gone down. And they're running out of things to sell, quite frankly. So increasing stadia size is one obvious avenue to explore.
Yeah, I think that's the important factor. I mean, broadcast is flat. Commercial is becoming challenging. So if you look at the number of clubs that have struggled to find high quality front of shirt sponsors, which is generally the biggest sponsor product that they have. We know Chelsea, for example, don't have any sponsor for the current season, which is a big hole. But it's not just them. Juventus have also struggled to find a front of shirt sponsor. So commercial is also quite difficult. If you have demand, and we know Arsenal are going to have demand, Chelsea would also have demand as well. at the right price, given the captive audience in central London, and would have it at decent headline prices. But Arsenal are probably in a uniquely strong position in that respect, just given where home is. And so it makes sense for them almost more than any other club, given that they've got the base of a stadium. If they can add those extra seats, that's the key challenge. Can they do it cost effectively? Then they can make that return on investment that very few clubs actually on a piece of paper seem to be able to do. The big question, for example, about Manchester United and building a brand new stadium that may take 3 years, that may have one season where they're not in the stadium. The big question there is, if you're spending £2.5 billion on that stadium build, and that's where it's going to be, by the way, by the time you get to the building project, given what we know the Spurs stadium cost, for example. If you're going to be spending £2.5 billion, you have to have very high prices to make a return on investment on a product like that. And you know, that's why it's a much simpler decision for Arsenal. If they can get the planning, and if the build can work on the existing stadium, it's almost a no-brainer. And you know, I don't think they'll be doing £3 million additional per match day. I think that would assume, not a 15,000 anyway. That would assume something like a £200 per fan or per seat revenue. But it'll still be 1.5 to £2 million extra per match day. And clearly, there's also a compounding element, because, you know, we talk about it today, but you're building the stadium, you're building those 20,000 seats for the next 50 years. And each year, the value of that seat is going up by, let's say, 5%. You compound 5% over 50 years, you're getting a very, very large return. So Arsenal, I think, are in a uniquely strong position from a stadium development perspective. And the rest of them, I do think there are some challenges in terms of actually how does the return on investment look.
Just one final thing on this, because it might be something that fans may not want to hear, but if these clubs find that expanding is too difficult and maybe something that they can't afford, how much more attractive would the idea of overseas games be in terms of bringing in more revenue, do you think?
Well, it's very attractive for the owners, and some owners have publicly said so. The elements of the Liverpool ownership group openly courted it. I'm sure the Chelsea's American owners would be very keen to explore that market, but it's politically very, very difficult. The Premier League's official position is it won't happen, as is the EFL's. I think that will be challenged over time, and they'll find it increasingly difficult to sort of hold the owners back. And my personal view is it makes perfect economic sense, and I also think, frankly, in a global world, when you've got a global fan base, that there is an element of taking your product to your fans. Every other sport does it across the world. Australian Rugby League going to Las Vegas next year. Super League's in Las Vegas. We see the NFL, NBA, baseball in London, NFL global roadshow, really, Brazil, Germany. I don't frankly see that football should consider itself so special and remote from these global market forces that it can afford to turn its nose up at it, just for traditional reasons.
Yeah, Matt's made himself extremely unpopular across the UK. I think it's going to be a challenge. I mean, clearly it makes sense if you could get some pretty big payments coming out of, particularly in the US, and if you look at what the Liverpool co-owner said, I can't remember which one it was, but he
was slapped down quite quickly by.
Well, he was slapped down by Liverpool themselves. But what he said is, I dream about a day when we could have a game in the morning in Riyadh, in the afternoon in Tokyo, and then we'd have a game in New York and a game in LA all in one, great day. And of course, that would generate quite a lot, for the clubs, especially because what you would see is US ticket prices. You'd probably have, because of the rarity of that event, you'd have ticket prices, I don't know, maybe at kind of Champions League level. So, Champions League final level. So maybe £500, $500 per ticket. That's clearly going to generate huge revenue for those clubs. But I think politically, particularly in the current environment, when we're on the verge of having the regulator come in I think it would be very hard for the Premier League clubs to float that. I think we are still in the shadow of the Super League. And I think, I also think there is some value in the Premier League being different. And actually, rather than taking that easy money, saying, well, actually, no, we are an English product. It is an English export. We play in England. And part of that is that we have the English stadiums with the English fans and everything that goes with that. And at some point you have to say, we're not taking that revenue. It's easy revenue, and we're always struggling for revenue, but we're not taking that revenue. We're going to concentrate actually on fixing the cost base. And the big issue that I think Premier League clubs have is not so much on the revenue side. I mean, the growth over the last 5 to 10 years on the revenue side has been strong. But what's not been strong is the cost control, and particularly on player wages. And you can fix quite a lot in terms of the need for more revenue if actually you can start to control costs in a more efficient way. And I think that's where the focus needs to be. Certainly, if you look at the Super League proposition, part of that was about controlling the costs. They were effectively going to put in place a soft salary cap. And I think the Premier League should be focusing more on that aspect than looking at taking the game abroad. I think there's a lot to be said for the Premier League being strong enough to say we don't need to take the low-hanging fruit that would be a game in Riyadh or New York.
I've got to say I'm on Stefan's side for the the overseas game. Sorry about that, Matt. If it does go overseas,
thrown him to the wall.
There is one other element of this, is that clubs are not going to continue to turn down revenue, which throws up, I think, player welfare issues. So you can make a case that they'd be better off playing fewer games, more meaningful games for more money, than flying off to Australia for 3 days in May, as Tottenham did last season, and many clubs will continue to do in the future. At some point, these brilliant athletes that we love watching, they're gonna break down. This year we've got Chelsea and Man City having to play proper games in the Club World Cup, and then after international break, before a new season starts. So there's no space left in the calendar, really.
Yeah, I mean, it is chaos in terms of the calendar, and to introduce another game abroad, I think would be a negative. I think one thing that could potentially work, and it would still be controversial, but one thing that could potentially work would be to have an FA Cup final abroad. Now, I know it would cause outrage, but it could work. It could work much easier than a run-of-the-mill Premier League game, or a Champions League final abroad. We already have a situation where
there was talks about going to New York for Champions League, weren't there, a few years ago? It didn't happen. But...
And I think it could make some sense in that we already have all of the fans likely to be flying into a third-party city. Mm-hmm. The additional incremental cost for the fans would be not that significant. A flight to, I don't know, Istanbul versus going off to New York. The difference is not enormous.
Baku seems to be UEFA's favourite city.
Well, and there's a good example.
For neutral venues, which is a long way away.
Yeah, exactly. So the distances are actually basically the same. It feels about as European, Baku. No. I'm sorry about our Baku viewers, but I think it could make some sense if they were so desperate to have it. Now that is the starting point for the Spanish game and also for the French game, in having the French Super Cup, I think it is, that's going to be played in Qatar with PSG, clearly. And I think they're generating €3 million from that one individual game. And we know that La Liga has done a Barcelona-Real Madrid game, I think, in the United Arab Emirates for one of the Super Cups. So if we had to have something abroad, those would be the games that I think would work best. They're already on neutral territory, so they're already being played in a neutral stadium, and they are clearly very big events. So maybe that could be the answer. But I think there's an obsession with playing these games abroad, which I don't necessarily see as being totally necessary.
Well, we'll see how it all plays out. Might see you there for the FA Cup final in New York at some point. Now, it's time for our talkSPORT Explainer, the part of the show where our panellists try and make sense of the question on everybody's lips. And this week, it's all about Manchester City. The Times have revealed the names of 4 clubs that want compensation if City are found guilty of some of the more serious 115 alleged breaches of financial rules. And it's not hard to guess which teams make up that 4, Stefan. Manchester United, Liverpool, Arsenal and Tottenham. Matt, it's as I say there, not hugely surprising that these clubs are perhaps chasing this if it does come through.
Yeah, they've put lawyers on notice that if City are found guilty of what has been described as a significant number of the 115 charges, they could potentially seek compensation. The reason they've done it, it's quite technical. They've received legal advice that a statute of limitations of 6 years could potentially come into place as of, I think, 5th November this month. That relates to 6 years since the initial allegations of City's alleged wrongdoing were made public in the German magazine Der Spiegel, and that sort of triggered this 6 years. UK law, any wrongdoing that's been on the books in the open for 6 years, you can't seek financial redress. So it's basically a housekeeping exercise. So if they decide to take legal action, they're in a position to do it. Whether they will do that or not is, of course, a different question.
Stefan, where are Chelsea in all of this? Because, of course, they're dealing with their own investigation. Is it a case of them simply wanting to stay out of it whilst that's all going on?
No, I don't think so. I suspect the story is incomplete, and that many more clubs will want to consider their position in terms of making a claim. And it very much depends what the decision says and what the findings are of the independent commission. I would think that every single club that has been in the Premier League and that has been potentially affected by any breaches that are found against City will want to pore over the decision in detail and consider if any of the factors that are disclosed within that decision affect them and give them a claim. And once they've done that, they will assess whether they have a loss connected to that particular matter.
But would it be fair to say that could literally be every single club in the league over those seasons?
Yeah, well, I think so. I think that you have to. It doesn't mean that they've all got a claim. I think you have to look at. Let's say there's 30 teams. I think we spoke about this on a previous episode. There may be 30 teams that were in the Premier League over the 9-year period. Every one of them has a potential claim. Right? It sounds like a ambulance chasing lawyer, but it is true that in theory, and all of this is obviously premised on City being found guilty and the charges being proven on the most serious substantive charges, and that's not so much on the cooperation side of things. But so if those charges are proven against City, every club may have a claim, and what they'll have to do is they'll have to assess loss and also causation, and can they prove that City's breaches caused that loss? And that will be the big challenge. And we know from the other case that was made public in relation to Everton. So when Everton were docked 10 points, which was later appealed, that independent commission at the same time told the outside world that a number of clubs, including Burnley, had applied to it for compensation, because under the Premier League rules, under Rule W51.5, the independent commission that's sitting in respect of the City case will also have the power to grant unlimited compensation to affected third parties. And that same thing applied with Everton, and we know that a number of clubs had said to that independent commission that they would look for compensation.
That was Leeds, Leicester, Forest, Burnley, Southampton. But
Correct.
in the end, they were withdrawn. Or
we heard nothing about it. But in the disclosure in the Times around this piece about United, Liverpool, Arsenal and Spurs going for compensation against City, it also said that we now know that all of the cases were dropped except for Burnley. And Burnley are still pursuing their case for compensation. And we expect that to take another year. But it is an interesting revelation that Burnley do feel that the independent commission that sat in relation to Everton will grant them compensation. But they will still have to prove out the causation piece and their loss. Now, their loss is probably relatively straightforward to show. They were relegated. They can say, but for Everton not doing what they did, Everton would have been relegated, we would have survived, and therefore we need compensation of X million pounds.
How much could they be looking at?
Well, look, that's the big question. We know that relegation for a team like Burnley will have cost probably over £100 million. The question is, can they show causation on a balance of probabilities, or will they look at another English law concept around loss of a chance? So there's another way in which you can make a claim, which is to demonstrate to the independent commission or the court or the tribunal that the actions of Everton, or in this case City, led to the loss of a chance of something else happening. And if they can demonstrate that there was a real and substantial chance of that thing happening, they may well get a proportion of their losses back. So it brings down the hurdle for the clubs in terms of causation, but also brings down the level of compensation. It's a deeply complicated issue. And if you think about the City situation and think about all of the clubs that may have been affected, and therefore all of the calculations that may need to be done, and then look at it over 9 years, and in each of those years there may be a different set of events that occurred, and it'll all be set out in the decision of the independent commission. But you get a feel for that matrix of complexity that we're going to have, where all of these things are going to have to be assessed by either an independent commission or arbitration, because none of this can go to the High Court. All the clubs agree that any of these disputes are dealt with in-house. So it's going to be a very, very complicated issue to deal with. And I'd be very, very doubtful that it's only those 4 teams that are going to be looking at this. I think there's a much bigger opportunity for those clubs, but it's all based on whether the independent commission finds against City.
And also, I think, crucially, the sanction. If City hit with what the other clubs deem to be a sufficiently strong punishment, that may impact on their decision to sue, I think.
Yeah. I mean, they may feel less aggrieved. I would still think that the lawyers will be looking at the cold hard numbers and saying, hang on a second, City have been punished severely for this, let's say, and why wouldn't you have a go? If you've got a workable case with a good demonstration of causation and meaningful loss, and we know that the losses are likely to be meaningful because we know that a Premier League place is £2 million on its own. So it's very hard to see how people's losses are not significant. And so I think, unfortunately, the way these things tend to work is the advisors get on the phone and they say, why would you not claim? You've got a viable claim here. Let's go for it.
Yeah. There's also another case going on involving Manchester City at the moment. This is the APT rules case. There's a vote on Friday with the Premier League clubs all meeting to vote on changes to these laws. This is after Man City brought legal action to the Premier League. Could you just take us through briefly, Matt, what is going on Friday with this vote?
Well, there's a meeting of the 20 clubs in London. Ostensibly, it's the Premier League's attempt to amend the APT rules that the Independent Commission deemed elements of which were unlawful in September, following the City legal challenge in the summer. The Premier League want to essentially tidy up some of the regulations to make them lawful, and it appears to all largely boiled down to very small changes in the drafting. They're going to want to change the phrase relating to related party transactions from you would receive this from your sister parent company to You Could, which Premier League thinks gives them more leeway and makes it more enforceable. To complicate matters, City say this is all very premature and that nothing should be even brought to a vote until they've received further guidance from the Commission. So basically, City don't want the vote to happen, and they're trying to get into the ear of the clubs to either vote against it or say we're going to abstain. The Premier League are pushing to get it resolved as quickly as possible, but I think they will only bring it to a vote if they're confident of winning. So there'll be lots of frantic conversations behind the scenes over the next couple of days to determine their position.
Just quickly, how do you see this playing out, Stefan?
Yeah, so I agree with Matt that the likely scenario and the situation that would happen in the outside world, so in corporate situations or in listed companies, if you get a situation where a company, and in this case the Premier League, tables a resolution at an extraordinary general meeting, which is what this is, if they get the sense that it's going to be rejected, what tends to happen is the vote gets pulled, as opposed to going through the process and having it rejected. It would clearly be very embarrassing for the Premier League if one of two things. If they place these changes in front of the clubs and they're turned down, that would be embarrassing. But the other thing that would also be embarrassing for the Premier League is if those changes are carried, and then in the next few days, the tribunal that's been asked for its further determinations in respect of certain related matters then says, by the way, certain things are unlawful, that cuts across the changes that were voted through on Friday. And that's why, ultimately, I think there's a very good chance that the vote will be pulled. I actually think it is a big if, but if the tribunal is going to give its determination in the near future, then I think the sensible thing to do would be to wait for that. Both parties have agreed to ask that tribunal further questions. Now, it seems to me, once they decided to do that together, in agreement, that the sensible thing to do is to pause any redrafting of the rules until you've got that determination as to the questions you've just asked the tribunal. Otherwise, you have a risk that we just end up in a loop of having to keep tweaking the rules. And there's no point in putting in place on Friday rules that are immediately unlawful. So we will see. I think, as Matt says, I imagine this week there is a lot of lobbying going on, both on the Premier League side and also on City side. And the other complexity here is just in terms of the way the voting works. And if you abstain, now we know that really all that's happening here in terms of the majority of the amendments is that we're going back to the original sets of associated party rules that were brought in 2021. But what happened with the additional changes that were made in February of this year is they got passed only by 12 votes voting in favour. And that was because a number of teams abstained. Now, in this scenario, if 5 teams abstain, and we could end up with a vote that gets carried only by 10 teams voting in favour. And I think that is another issue potentially for the Premier League, because it will the optics of a vote being passed by only 10 teams will not look great. So there's a lot of risk, I think, on Friday, on all sides, but particularly on the Premier League side. And I think overall, they need to the whole volume and the whole abrasive nature of the communication between the parties all needs to be toned down. They've got to work together going forward. So it'll be very interesting. I mean, it'll be quite dramatic, I think, on Friday if the vote goes on.
We'll see how it all plays out. Now, the news never stops coming out of Old Trafford at the moment, and whilst it seems mainly positive, Ruben Amorim is about to begin his reign on Sunday. The Daily Mail have been reporting that United are considering cutting the budget they had to their Disabled Supporters Association in half. This comes amongst an array of cost-cutting measures by Ineos, and next up could be a reduction in the £40,000 given to the Manchester United Disabled Supporters Association. No final decision on this yet has been made. But for the latest, let's bring in Mike Keegan, sports news correspondent from the Daily Mail. Mike, good to have you with us. Just firstly, could you outline to us what the Disabled Association do for and with the club?
Absolutely. But first, I just want to say how happy I am that you've already dealt with Manchester City in the Premier League, because that feels like all we've been dealing with for, as far back as I can remember. As you said, United with Ineos coming in have raised a wide kind of array of cost-cutting measures. They've looked at every department. They've left no stone unturned. And to be fair, there is a reason that they're doing this. It's created a lot of criticism. I think, as we wrote, that they've made 250 people redundant across the business. They're saying that they're doing this because, despite the £650 million worth of revenue that United have made, it was a very fatty kind of organisation, and they wanted to make it leaner. And the reason they're doing that is because they want to spend the money that they save on the first team squad, because, as we know, there's a lot of work that needs to be done there. The Disabled Supporters Association gets £40,000 a year, and it's almost like an institution at United Mudsa. It's one of the oldest disabled supporters associations, if not the oldest in the world, at a football club. And it's the players have always really liked doing their bit for it. There's a Christmas party that nearly the entire first team squad attends, and they'll go and see the disabled supporters and pose for selfies, sign autographs. There's events throughout the year. They have a bowling day that's very popular. They have the annual dinner that was only last month. Dennis Irwin was the guest there. And basically the story is that they have been told that £40,000 a year budget that they get for those types of activities could be cut in half to 20,000, which, as I've outlined why they're doing this, that they are looking at money to be spent on the first team. But as a lot of people have pointed out, taking £20,000 away from a group like the Disabled Supporters Association just doesn't seem worth it for the optics and obviously the impact that will have on its members.
Yeah, you mentioned the optics there, Mike. It just seems absolutely bizarre, especially given that they've just paid something like 12 million to Erik ten Hag and his goodbye package, having left the club. Why is it that they are looking at areas that just seem so minimal to try and lessen everything? What's their justification?
Our argument is that you can't just treat this in isolation. They are looking at similar areas. So while this is only 20,000, this is one of dozens of areas where they can cut 20,000 here, they can cut 20,000 there, and all of a sudden that 20,000 turns into a couple of million, maybe even more than that. But as you've said, that kind of pales into insignificance when you see the payoff that's been given to Ten Hag. If I'm a member of Mudsa, I'm thinking, well, hang on a minute. Your decision, why on earth should we be paying for your decision to give Ten Hag to keep him in the first place, to give him an extra year on his contract, and to then back him in the summer with, obviously, signings that don't appear to have worked out yet. And then, you go even beyond that. And Ineos might claim it's not on their watch, but players like Mason Mount, Anthony, why should one of the more worthy areas of the club have to pay for the mistakes of those? And why should you take £20,000 away when that's not even a tenth of a lot of the players' salary in a week?
Mike, what are you hearing from club officials and people at Carrington about the changes since Ineos have come in, the upheaval that they've brought to the club? How are people finding it?
So you hear a lot from people who've left the club. Obviously, that's the nature of the job. They're more inclined to speak to you because they're not worried about losing their jobs because that's already happened. And they are very, very disappointed and upset with the way it's gone. I think one of the things about United, and I noticed this, I worked at the Manchester Evening News, that was my first job, and the first thing that struck me about United was that from the outside you have a view of it as this huge football club, arguably the biggest football club in the world. And yet when you go through the door at Carrington, when you go through the door at Old Trafford, it always retained a family feel. There were people working in there who'd been there years. It was very down to earth. It felt like a big, but still a family club. And there's a feeling that it's lost a lot of that. It's lost a lot of its soul. Some of the decisions that they've made, there was, the decision around the Wembley FA Cup final tickets and to cut back on the numbers of tickets given to staff, the transport down there. And that used to be a big day out. And that dated back to the days of Matt Busby, Sir Matt, who, we're all in this together. And when we succeed, we all get to share in that. So there is a feeling that United is losing a lot of its soul and a lot of what made it Manchester United. However, the flip side of that, and I know it's only been a week and people are probably scoffed because they've not even played a game yet, the appointment, obviously the biggest thing is what happens on the pitch. And the appointment of Amorim so far he himself has impressed those that have come across his path in the first week. It's a job that obviously needs somebody with charisma, with kind of, the personality to be able to deal with what managing Manchester United brings. And all the signs so far point to him being able to deal with that. And they're all looking forward to finally getting things right on the pitch.
Matt, are you surprised at the optics of some of these decisions from Ineos?
I'm increasingly less surprised because they keep happening, don't they? Which suggests that they're almost entirely balance sheet led and not public relations led, which is a reasonable position. Whether that's the best one in the long run, I'm not personally convinced. Clearly, this is what Jim Ratcliffe does, right? He takes over businesses, often takes over distressed assets, slashes the costs, builds them up. So whilst it may upset United fans and certainly staff, it's not a surprise that that's the way he's operating.
Does this one feel like a step too far, though, taken from the Disabled Supporters Association?
Well, I think it's bananas. I mean, if you got a situation where a saving of £20,000. I mean, on any basis, £20,000 is going nowhere in terms of the context of Manchester United. But it's not just £20,000. I mean, from a PR perspective, it's all well and good to say, well, they're not bothered about PR. Well, they're a consumer-facing business. They have to be bothered about PR. It's a very important element of the brand of Manchester United. And that's quite apart from the impact that it actually has on the association, which presumably slashing the budget in half is going to have a very significant impact because it's in half. So I think it's completely crazy from any sort of standpoint, including, to be honest, from a business perspective, because it's all very well saying, well, Ineos usually go into a manufacturing business that's in distress, and therefore they're looking for every 20,000 they can save. And if you get 50 20,000s, then that's worth quite a lot when you add it all together. But the reality is that's not the situation. Football clubs are not manufacturing businesses. They're not a distressed manufacturing business. A football club is a very unique organisation, partly because of what it means in the community, but also because there's very few industries in the world where you have maybe 20 people at the top of the organisation that are paid many hundreds of thousands of pounds per week and are often not performing. And that's a unique situation, and it does put into context these sorts of changes that you try and make downstream within the organisation. I think the easiest thing for them to have done, had they decided that this was essential for the profit and loss account of the company, which, as I say, I think is crazy. Very easy for Ratcliffe to just say, we are cutting it in half, but I'm personally putting in the £20,000 a year. There we go. So don't worry about it in terms of your money. We want to do it because we want to keep the club as sound as possible from a financial perspective. But don't worry, Mudsa, you'll be whole because Sir Jim has put his hand in his pocket. And in any event, if he was paying tax in the UK, he could get gift aid and he could get another 25% on top. But if he's not, then that might not work.
Yeah, it does seem bizarre. Mike, thank you very much indeed for your time. Mike Keegan, their sports news correspondent from the Daily Mail. Thank you very much indeed for your company, and thanks again to our guests, Stefan Borson and Matt Hughes. See you next time.